So this is MICROPROFILE State of the Union. What I plan to do here is actually give you a very high-level overview of what MICROPROFILE is. If you don't know what MICROPROFILE is, you really should know it as a Java developer. And principally, what my goal is actually going to be is whet your appetite into the rest of the content that's actually in the conference. So that's what I was telling you before as to why I can compress this talk. Because a lot of the content that I will be talking about, other people at this conference will be talking about in much greater detail. We actually have, I counted about 10 different talks on MICROPROFILE related topics, all from good friends of mine, and I'm very grateful for them. So basically, I'm going to rely on them to give you a more in-depth view, and I'm going to stay at a relatively high level with MICROPROFILE without digging too deep. Okay, so here's our agenda. I'm going to go through this agenda relatively quickly. I hope to finish in about half hour. So we're going to start with some basic introductions of what MICROPROFILE is. We're going to do a little bit of a history run. So we're going to talk about the past, present, and future of what MICROPROFILE, what's going on in the MICROPROFILE ecosystem. Finally, we'll do a feature tour, and we'll keep it very high level and very brief and very quick. Here we'll be talking about precisely what the MICROPROFILE features and what are the kind of things that MICROPROFILE brings to the table for you as an individual Java developer. And finally, we'll finish up with a summary. So let's start at the very beginning as to what precisely MICROPROFILE is. Java EE in general, Java E8 in particular, is a very capable platform. If you're writing monolithic applications, it basically is very feature complete. You don't need a whole lot of frameworks or libraries beyond what Java 8 provides to write sensible monolithic applications. In fact, you can actually write coarse-grained microservices using nothing much more than Java 8. I gave a talk on this a couple of years ago at Java2Days. If you want to know what I mean by that, you can actually go look it up on YouTube. And there's a talk about pragmatic microservices using Java EE. However, let's say for a second that that's not good enough for you, and you want to really do what things like Netflix and Google are doing. Well, if you try to do that, then Java EE won't be enough. There will be some design patterns that you will need to implement that Java EE simply does not address. Well, normally speaking, this would not be a problem, because if we had a normal Java EE release cadence, these features would be incorporated into Java EE. But as you know, Java EE has had some hiccups in prior years that have now been solved with Jakarta EE. But what this has done is that it has created a temporal and a feature gap. So there's a gap that Java EE does not address in terms of solving very fine-grained microservice features. And we'll talk about what some of those features are. Some of those features you may or may not actually be even aware of. So the goal of MICROPROFILE is to do something like standardization light. So it's basically a community-based open source project that provides all of these features that builds upon the Java EE platform. In fact, the basis for MICROPROFILE is actually Java EE. It's a Java EE subset of Java EE APIs, and it builds on top of those features. Obviously, the good news here is that as Jakarta EE progresses, so finally we have a real progress in moving Java EE forward and bringing it in the open and accelerating its pace. Well, what that enables us to do is eventually merge MICROPROFILE and Jakarta EE, and I would imagine that will probably happen in the span of the next year or so, but not right now. Right now we are talking about MICROPROFILE as its own thing. So what is MICROPROFILE specifically? As I mentioned, these are specific point features in implementing design patterns that mostly make sense in very, very fine-grained microservices. So these are things like open tracing, open API, type-safe REST client, dynamic configuration, all of these things that I'm listing here, all based on basically your plain vanilla core subset of vanilla Java EE APIs, things like CDI, JSON-P, JAX-RS, and JSON binding. Right? And we'll see in a second what exactly these means, hopefully not in too much nauseating detail. So, as you can see, MICROPROFILE is a community-based effort. Right? So in a sense, it's very similar to the JCP. Right? So in fact, some of these players are JCP players. These are people that actually are implementers of Java EE that are going out of the JCP to further accelerate the pace and close this gap between the needs of microservices-based systems and what Java EE8 itself provides. In fact, most, if not all of the Java EE implementations today not only are shipping Java EE, but they are shipping Java EE plus MICROPROFILE features. In fact, there are some runtimes that are only providing MICROPROFILE features as well. So Thorntail is a good example. Thorntail or Wildfly Swarm is a good example of that. They don't actually aim to provide Java EE8. What they aim to provide is really MICROPROFILE plus whatever it is that you may need. Now, the one interesting aspect of this that I hopefully will be talking to you more about in subsequent years, hopefully in the next year, is that notice some of these names, right? Some of these are familiar names, things like Pyara, Red Hat, IBM. These are familiar names to you in the Java EE ecosystem. But notice these interesting new names, right? So there are interesting new names like Lightbend and Microsoft that you normally wouldn't associate with Java EE technologies. And I think this is a very interesting dynamic. This should give you a clue as to why you should be taking this very, very seriously. This is not just your vanilla, plain old random Java EE project. There's much more open source project. There's a lot more going on behind this, and there's a lot of industry weight behind what is going on in MICROPROFILE. Okay, so let's cover a little bit about the past, present, and future, and this is the part that I'll try to truncate and fast forward. I'll just take you through the logical progression of the life cycles of what MICROPROFILE has been. So the initial version of MICROPROFILE came out about 2 years ago in September 2016. This is the time period, remember, when Oracle essentially stopped working on Java EE, and the rest of the Java EE vendors, namely Red Hat and Microsoft, decided they need to do something about this. And their response to accelerating the pace of Java EE innovation was MICROPROFILE in September 2016. Started very, very small. Started with a very, very small subset of Java EE7 APIs that make sense in minimalistic microservices-based systems. And that is CDI 1.2, JSON-P 1.2, and JAX-RS 2.0. Moving forward, what they did was, beyond simply using the established subset of Java EE APIs, they actually added new features, right, that would make sense in fine-grained microservices. The first one being config 1.0. We'll talk about config 1.0, config in a little bit and explain what that is. But the main point here is that now, just in a few months, what we saw is new innovations being added at a much faster pace than you would expect in Java EE. Moving forward even more, you see the addition of even more technologies and rapid updates of each of these technologies. In fact, on average, MICROPROFILE has been releasing releasing every 3 months, and that's remarkable. It's more in line with a regular old random open source project than it is about a standard. And yet, these are standards-based features. In fact, MICROPROFILE isn't just an open source project; it's an open source standard. Right? There's multiple implementations of all of these features that are being defined, and that's very remarkable indeed. Again, with MICROPROFILE 1.3, that's January 2018, more of the same, right? So a mix of no changes and point changes to the existing APIs and the addition of new APIs. In fact, 3 new APIs were added back in January 2018, Open Tracing, Open API, and REST Client, which finally brings us to MICROPROFILE 1.4. This is the last branch that uses Java EE7. Again, as you can see, slightly decelerating pace of innovation. So now it's really more along the lines of maintenance releases, if you will. Also in June of 2018, what you saw is MICROPROFILE upgrading from a Java EE7 base to a Java EE8 base, right? So these are upgraded versions of the existing APIs that were already in MICROPROFILE, namely CDI 2.0, JSON-P 1.1, and JAX-RS 2.1. And in addition, bringing in JSON-B from Java EE8. Right? This is a brand new API that was added as part of Java EE8. So now MICROPROFILE isn't just a Java EE7 technology, it's also caught up with the Java EE release base, and now it is a Java EE8 plus technology. Again, this is the latest version now, right? So we're basically in current state, where we are today. These are the APIs that exist in MICROPROFILE at this moment. The last release was just update of one API, namely Open Tracing 1.2. So what exactly is in these sorts of features? I'll give you just a brief example of this. I won't go through it in very much detail, just for the sake of time. So basically, as you can see, these are coarse grains. So each of these are the prior version of Open Tracing. Included in the prior version of MICROPROFILE was Open Tracing 1.1. Right? And within 3 months, we have an Open Tracing 1.2. And as you can see, the release features here basically reflect a very fast-moving project. Right? There's always small changes that are happening at a relatively rapid pace with MICROPROFILE. There are some other changes that have happened as well with the current release. So namely, there's two other very interesting standards that are going to come in as part of MicroProfile, namely reactive stream operators. This is actually going to be at an even faster pace than what MicroProfile is. So they're going to have intermediate releases even in the interim of between MicroProfile releases. MicroProfile itself, as you saw, was decelerating a little bit because they're already standardizing a lot of the most well-understood features. So now they're moving from 4 releases per year to 3 releases per year. Still a very, very rapid pace by most standards. So what is going to be in MicroProfile 2.2? As I mentioned, the reactive messaging and reactive operators features. I won't talk about these in great detail during this talk, but come to the panel that's going to be tomorrow. In the panel, we'll talk more about what reactive messaging and reactive operators are. These are truly unique features. They don't actually exist in the Java ecosystem at all. But other than that, what you're seeing is basically maturity of the existing APIs. The rest of these are all going to be point API releases included in February 2019, other than the reactive features. Okay, so these are the active topics under discussion. Right? I won't go through these in great detail. In the interest of time, come to the panel tomorrow. We'll talk about more of these in detail later. Okay, so let's talk about the feature tours. What exactly is MicroProfile about beyond these acronyms? So these are what they are. The first one I'm going to talk about is OpenAPI. So what is OpenAPI? OpenAPI, the long and short of OpenAPI is that it is WSDL for REST. Right? Just like we had WSDL in the SOAP world, now we have a rendition of it for REST. So this is a way of describing your APIs, self-documenting your APIs as part of your services themselves, right? AKA Swagger. So if those of you who are aware of Swagger, OpenAPI is basically Swagger core. So what MicroProfile does is that it is basically a binding for Swagger or OpenAPI for Java applications. All you really do is you turn on one little flag in your microservice, and lo and behold, all of your microservices are now going to be self-documented. They're going to generate their own Swagger or OpenAPI documentation just by going to service name / OpenAPI. A very, very powerful capability. You can do some additions to this as well. So in addition to simply automatically generating documentation, you can further customize your documentation. For example, in this case, I'm just adding 2 different annotations describing what the operation is, what is my service actually doing, and what are the response types that are needed. I have a single example here of a response to code 200, but you can imagine all kinds of other responses. For example, 401 for not authorized, 502 for wrong data being entered, and so on and so forth. So these are all going to be ultimately generated in your OpenAPI or Swagger documentation based on the metadata that's being read in your JAX-RS endpoint. Open tracing, this is another important one. One of the biggest problems in microservices is diagnosing what went wrong. Right? Because what happens in a microservice is that you have a complex chain of invocations. Right? You start the invocation at one place, that service invokes another, that service may invoke yet others. Right? So how do you figure out what happened? Right? Where did things go wrong? This is a very important problem in distributed systems. Well, there is this standard, again, this open standard out there outside of the Java ecosystem called Open Tracing, the Open Tracing Alliance. And what they do is they've come up with a standard to handle this. Right? So there should be graphical tools and instrumentation in your applications that allow you to take a look at what happened. Right? So you take an invocation, and end to end, this tool will tell you these are the various services that are invoked, and these are all of the values that were returned at each point. And that's what open tracing is about. So what this is basically a Java binding for open tracing. Again, similar to OpenAPI, all you really do in your microservices MicroProfile application is turn on a flag. And lo and behold, open tracing will automatically be enabled. So you feed you turn on a MicroProfile open tracing, and then you can now take a look at console applications like Jaeger or Zipkin, and it will tell you these are all what your MicroProfile applications are actually doing. You can, again, customize it, right, if you want to. So for example, there is an @trace annotation that will allow you to in this case, specify a name for your traced operation, as well as specify that, yes, we want all of the inbound and outbound values of this service published into something like Zipkin or Jaeger. JWT propagation. Again, what is this about? This is about security in microservices-based systems. So, security in a traditional sense doesn't really work with microservices anymore. Again, it's the same problem that we talked about before, is that microservices are not just a single point-to-point operation. You don't just invoke one service. One service may invoke another one and may invoke another one. So the question becomes, how do you propagate authentication and authorization information across these nested services without forcing your user to log in again and again? So the answer to this is basically authentication tokens, and it's not a new solution, right? For example, if you're familiar with the SOAP world, SAML does exactly the same thing. Right? SAML's job is basically to act as a security context propagation layer across SOAP web services. Same thing is done now with JSON, using JSON Web Token, or JWT for short, right? This is the protocol, this is the format that things like OAuth and OpenID use under the hood. And again, all you really do here is you turn on just a few configuration steps in your microprofile application, and now your microprofile application is capable of recognizing JWT tokens. You just use the same old Java EE annotations that you've used before. Let's say in my example, I have a web service to get all membership information. Obviously, you don't want this kind of service to be invocable by everyone. So you're going to secure to say that only users with a role of admin is allowed to invoke this service. Well, this invocation, this authorization information is actually going to be pulled from JWT, not your regular old basic authentication or what have you in a normal Java EE system. But once you, in MicroProfile, you enable JWT, this information, like what is the user's role, is going to be read from the JWT token instead. Configuration. This is an interesting one in a sense that it's not that Java EE doesn't have configuration features, it does. Right? So there's a whole bunch of ways of configuring Java EE applications, right? You can use WebXML, you can use ejbjar.xml, you can use CDI configuration facilities, CDI producers to do configuration. But the problem with these sorts of configurations in Java EE systems is that they are static, or they're largely static, which means you do the configuration during a deployment time, and that is static for the purposes of the application. If you needed to change something in the configuration of the application, well, you need to rebuild that application and redeploy it. That works for the most part. Again, it works very well in monolithic applications. It doesn't work in certain cases of microservices where you would want to modify the configuration of the system at runtime dynamically. Right? And that's basically the gap that the configuration API in MicroProfile addresses. Okay? So now you can actually modify a Java EE application configuration without needing to do a redeployment. How does this work? It works quite simply like this. So you put in an annotation, you say @inject config property, let's say in this case I want the host name to be injected. I'm specifying a default value. Well, this value can now be read from multiple different sources that can change at runtime. So by default, it can be read from a specifically defined properties file in your microservices application. It could be read from the system properties. It could be read from environment variables or any other custom configuration source that you may provide. Anything that you can think of. For example, your cloud provider's configuration map or a database. Right? So all of these capabilities are built into the MicroProfile configuration APIs. REST client. I think most of you are probably familiar with JAX-RS. And JAX-RS has a REST client capability, but the problem with that API is that it is loosely coupled, right? Which means it's not always very easy to use, and it is relatively verbose, and it's not type safe. However, if you're familiar with how JAX-WS clients work, well, JAX-WS clients actually don't require you to do that. You can actually take a server-side interface and say, please generate a stub of this. Based on this, reusing this interface, generate a stub that I can invoke from the client side. An example of this is something like this. Okay, so instead of making low-level get and post requests, what you will do is you will say, hey, my REST client builder, simply build me a stub of my service by taking this interface definition. And this interface definition is shared between the client and the server. And then you can simply make type-safe invocations, as though literally you're making these invocations locally as opposed to doing them remotely. So that's MICROPROFILE REST client. Health checks, what are these? These are in, solving another specific problem that occur in microservices-based systems. So microservices-based systems are distributed, right? So you're not dealing with simply one point of failure. Potentially you're dealing with many points of failure. And there needs to be an automated way of monitoring these failures and potentially self-healing. So if you're familiar with something like Kubernetes service controllers, what they need to do is take a look at all of the service nodes that are in a microservice and detect that a service has failed. And when it does that detection, the Kubernetes controller will actually restart that pod for you on your behalf. Well, in order to do that, there needs to be some mechanism by which Kubernetes controller can ask a node, hey, are you healthy, right? And that's really what health check is. It provides a well-known endpoint that you can hook up into something like a Kubernetes service controller that will allow an external controller to say, hey, is this service up and running? Okay, and you simply implement that by using one annotation and having an application scope bean, and you implement one method to say, hey, is my service currently up and running or not? And you can, it doesn't need to be just about this service. You can make nested invocations into any dependent resources to figure out whether a service is healthy or not. Metrics is very similar. So in addition to simply having a binary value of up or down, well, you can also collect different types of metrics that are useful for monitoring, both for human monitoring as well as automated monitoring and using something like Prometheus with Kubernetes. So how do you do that? Again, what you do is you simply define a set of services using annotations that will collect these metrics and publish these metrics for you. So for example, if you enable this bit of code in a microservices application, and then you went to your service endpoint and said /metrics, well, it's going to give you all of these metrics. Right? In this case, I'm collecting two different metrics. So I'm taking what the average response time to get all memberships is, and that is being collected for me automatically via this one annotation. Another metric I'm collecting here is a number of invocations of a particular service. And there's many other such metrics. There are 3 or 4 other such annotations that you can use to automatically collect and publish metrics for your application that you can use in some kind of centralized console or do something interesting, automate something interesting using these metrics endpoints. The final one I'm going to talk about before I finish off the talk is fault tolerance. This is actually a set of features rather than a single feature. But the basic idea here is that microservices are prone to failure. Right? When you have many different interdependencies and many different services deployed, any one of those services can fail. And you need to figure out in an intelligent way what happens, how do you deal with failure? And there's some specific design patterns around that. So these are design patterns like retry policies, bulkheads, and circuit breakers, timeouts, and things of that nature. Okay, so you can implement these sorts of design patterns certainly by yourself, right? You could hard code a bunch of if-then-else statements within your application to say, hey, if I invoke a service and it fails, do this, right? If this service doesn't respond by such and such a time, do this. Well, instead of hard coding all of that stuff by yourself every single time, what MICROPROFILE allows you to do is express those types of logic in terms of a declarative annotation-based syntax. Right? I won't go through this in very great detail, but you can basically take a look at an example here. So what I'm doing here is I have a get membership invocation. I'm specifying here declaratively what happens in case of various failures. So what do I do if there is a bulkhead? The bulkhead annotation 2 means if this service fails twice, take it offline. Tell all of its users that this service is now done. Timeout is specified to 3 seconds. Okay, so if this service does not respond by 3 seconds, it will automatically produce a failure message to its consumer. Similarly, a circuit breaker is specifying if a runtime exception happens, well, you need to detect that runtime exception and you need to do something with it. Right? There's some specific action you need to do. In this case, it's simply producing a delay and a retry. But you can do something much more sophisticated, like invoke another service in case there is a circuit breaker failure. So those are some of the features. Hopefully I haven't taken up too much of your time. Again, my goal was to keep this at a relatively high level and to give you a bird's eye view of what precisely is in MICROPROFILE. Again, there's going to be other people throughout the conference that are going to do a deep dive of these specific features. If you want to learn more about them, I highly suggest you visit some of those sessions. In the meanwhile, you are definitely, I would welcome you to investigate these things yourself if you haven't done so already. This is a very, very important thing, trust me. This is going to be just as important and just as relevant as Java SE and Java EE itself. Because this is where all of these various vendors are getting together and standardizing and agreeing upon how they want to handle fine-grained microservices-based systems. How do you get involved? Well, you get involved through these resources. I haven't put this slide up yet. I will do so right after this talk. You can go and take a look at my slide deck. Just Google me. You'll be able to find it from Speaker Deck. I'll put it up on Speaker Deck. You should be able to find the slides there and take a look at these links on your own and get involved and help move this important standard forward. Okay, thank you very much. I think that's all the time I'm going to take up from you. Very much appreciate it. Ishkan, shall we do Q&A or should we let people go? I'll leave it up to you. Is he even here?
Let's go.
Okay, show of hands. Do you want to go for lunch or do you want to do Q&A? Go for lunch? No? Nobody wants to go for lunch? How about want to do Q&A? So I'll let you ask some questions. And I'm going to time box it to 10 minutes. After 10 minutes, I'll let you go so you can go ahead and have your lunch. Any questions on any of what I talked about? Okay. Is somebody there with a mic that can? Okay, do you want to just yell out your question? Okay, so, all right, there we go.
Hi, thank you for the talk. So my question is, isn't it the microphone now evaluating from micro in the meaning of a small to a microservice profile actually? Because what I'm seeing is that you're doing lots of microservice stuff that you're actually covering that gap that you said, and it's not a micro as minor or small, but now micro is a microservice profile.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I said these features are geared towards fine-grained microservices, which means is that when you begin to write very fine-grained microservices, you're more likely to need these patterns. You're more likely to need things like, for example, the fault tolerance features that I talked about. But you are correct in the sense that the size of the service actually doesn't matter. These features are there for you. In fact, I've seen applications already that are monolithic applications that are actually using these services, MICROPROFILE services, because they're useful. So, for example, things like the Open API or JWT. Well, you need those services no matter what the size of your microservices. That's a very good observation. I would agree. It's not about the size of your service. It really is a question of understanding these features and making use of them in a sensible way. Okay, any other questions? Okay, going on. We have eight more minutes to go, but we don't have to use up the 8 minutes. If you don't have any questions, we can just go for lunch.
Actually, there is one more talk.
Okay.
So you won't go for lunch.
All right.
Forget it.
Please, are you going to give him the mic? I think this gentleman from Bosch has a question.
Are you ready?
Yeah.
No, I just think that I have one more talk after you, after your lunch. I asked the organizer to give me 4 minutes to 2 hours, and they put me prior lunch. I hope it will be not 2 hours.
All right, point taken. I think enough is enough. Thank you very much. I very much appreciate it. Please do attend some of the other. Very good.